Our simple message is that sanctions should be maintained. We are saying so because sanctions were introduced for the purpose of dismantling apartheid and of making sure that every South African, black and white, is able to determine his own future. Apartheid is doomed. South Africa shall be free. The struggle continues. A luta continua. Thank you.
Meeting with Mandela is made possible by grants from the Robert Wood Johnson Jr. Charitable Trust, the Commonwealth Fund, the Carl C. Icahn Foundation, the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, the Jacob Burns Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and by the members of 13. From the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, a meeting with Nelson Mandela, with Charlene Hunter-Gault.
Good evening, I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault. During the 27 years of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment, many, if not most, of the people in this audience have been intimately involved in the South African saga, either as journalists and writers, as academics, business people, or as activists. They pursued their interests despite the fact that one primary source was off limits to them. Tonight, we have brought them and that source together, and we will spend the next hour filling in some of the gaps that the years of imprisonment and more recently distance have created. Mr. Mandela, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
We want to explore tonight your vision of a future South Africa and how you see getting there. And I'd like to start just by asking you about perhaps a very important meeting that took place today with you and American businessmen. You reassured them about the security of private investments in a post-apartheid South Africa. What do you say to those who say that money is not going to flow to a society in transition, especially after the massive withdrawal of funds that has taken place over the past decade or so?
We do not know what the response of the international community is going to be when we call for assistance in building a new South Africa. But what we know is that the international community has got the resources to help us if they wanted to see a non-racial South Africa after the dismantling of apartheid.
Were they attempting to get you to reassure them that the society would be stable?
It is natural on the part of businessmen to want to assure themselves that when democratic changes take place in a country, their investments will be saved. There is nothing unusual as far as that is concerned. And I think that we have been able, from our side, to assure them that we are keenly aware of the importance of assuring businessmen that their investments will be safe.
Companies that have argued that it's better to stay and use their leverage inside the company to affect change also have argued that after a company has withdrawn, generally there's no coming back. How do you respond to that argument, and how much does the country need that investment?
Firstly, the argument that by companies that it is better for them to remain in South Africa flies in the face of the considered opinion of opinion makers in South Africa. The decision that companies should disinvest is that of the political organizations in the country and other democratic formations. It is the opinion of the trade union movement in the country which guards the interest of the workers themselves. It is also the opinion of religious organizations in the country. And it is the opinion of professional associations. What right has any company then in that situation to say it is better for the country for them to remain? They are looking at the matter purely from the point of view of their own interests. And we don't accept that we have to be guided by the views of people who don't consider the interests of the country as a whole, but of their own, from the point of view of their own profits.
Joe Davidson of the Wall Street Journal, you were covering that business meeting this morning. Would you like to follow up?
Mr. Mandela, you indicated this morning that nationalization is one tool among several options that may be considered in a restructured South African economy. Can you tell us what those other options are and how it will be decided which option will be used?
One option was suggested by a businessman this morning of forming a bank which would channel funds and resources to a new South Africa. That is another channel, another option.
You've also indicated that you are open to suggestion. I mean, is this a policy that is in process of formation now, in which you are taking stock of the situation and taking advice from a wide variety of sources?
This is not something new. Those who have followed political developments in our country know that this is no novel attitude on our part. We have made it clear right from the beginning that we are looking at various options. State participation is just one of those options.
Frank Borges, Treasurer of the State of Connecticut.
Mr. Mandela, as Treasurer of the State of Connecticut, I serve as the sole trustee of an $8.5 billion pension fund that is now fully divested. During that period of time, I had the occasion to visit with a number of leaders of the major corporations in America who did in fact say to me that they felt strongly, as a follow-up to an earlier question, felt rather strongly that their presence there indeed helped South Africans, provision of jobs, health care, education, and that in fact their withdrawal would cause more suffering. Now I realize that that argument at least was not compelling to me, and I hear that it wasn't compelling to you, but I'd like to have you comment further on that.
Well, I don't think I have anything to comment about that. I have said satisfactory on this question. If you wanted to suggest anything more, you are free to do so.
So much of the attention since you've been here, Mr. Mandela, has been on the question of nationalization, which you've given quite extensive response to. But there are some other aspects of the whole question of redistribution of wealth that I think Mike Clough wants to pursue.
Yes, Mr. Mandela. For most of the last century, black South Africans have been prohibited from owning land in 87% of the country. And the question of redistributing land is obviously going to be at the top of your agenda. Zimbabwe, a country to the north, is now 10 years past independence and is still having difficulties dealing with this question. Do you have any models in mind as to how to deal with the land question after the end of apartheid? And what will be your position on this question?
We don't work on the basis of models. We work on the basis of the needs of our people and our country. Secondly, we don't think that this is a question that is going to be settled overnight. It's a matter which will receive proper attention, the views of experts on the matter, but what we are determined to do is to redress that imbalance. How long it will take will depend on the conditions existing at the time when we address the question.
I just want to turn briefly now to the whole area of negotiations. Part of the problem you are faced with now is getting the South African government to meet all of the preconditions that have been laid out for the beginning of negotiations, but there are other problems that complicate the climate. Earl Caldwell, you wanted to address one.
Yes, Mr. Mandela, yesterday you mentioned, and quite surprisingly, that the ANC was involved in talks with some of the right-wing conservative groups in South Africa. I would like to know if you were personally involved in those talks and what were some of those groups, and what was it that motivated you to, or necessitated these to take place?
This is not a question of personalities. The question of discussing with specific groups in the country on the question of the peace process is the responsibility of the organization. It makes no difference who is there. It is those who are authorized by the organization to take part in that process. And it is the organization that is important, not individuals. Secondly, we don't think it is in the interest of solutions in South Africa to be publicizing precisely with whom we are discussing and what we said. It should be sufficient for you to know that this is one of the problems which we are addressing.
If I could just follow up on that, Mr. Mandela, as you know, there have been reports of death threats to top officials of the African National Congress, including yourself, on your arrival back in South Africa. Are those groups, do you consider people who make those kinds of threats to be beyond the pale? Or are those groups also groups with whom you think you can enter into some kind of negotiation? I mean, do you write these off, or do you reach out to them, or what?
I do not think in terms of death threats. My bosses here have given me sufficient work, which occupies my attention from morning to sunset. I don't think about death threats at all. I have not examined the question whether the people from whom these threats come are beyond the pale. But one thing I know is that the government itself has created a monster. They are the people who have been demonizing the ANC all along. They are the people who have trained the police that their duty is to protect the white minority against the threat from the African National Congress and similar organizations. So that if today, despite the fact that they themselves now believe that there should be a complete change in their policy, nevertheless they are dealing now with a monster which they have created. And it has to be expected that these threats should be made. But again, you will be making a mistake if you think that there are people beyond the pale. Discussions, it has been established now that discussions can bring about fundamental changes in the attitudes of individuals. And the meeting that we've held with the government and the whole peace process shows that you can change people's ideas by talking.
Excuse me, but who do you think can harness that monster that you're talking about? Whose responsibility is it?
You mean the responsibility of dealing with the monster?
Yes.
It is the responsibility of everybody who would think that the country should be mobilized around the question of peace.
Jennifer Whitaker, I believe you have a flip side of that question.
Yes. Mr. Mandela, I'd like to ask you the question that was most often asked to me by Americans on a trip that I took through the South and the Southwest in March, right after your release, which was in a way a kind of celebration of your release, talking about South Africa. That question is, as your country moves, we hope, away from the white violence against blacks, which is the apartheid system, a shadow may be falling across that process and also across the future of South Africa in the shape of black political violence. And I wonder what the ANC and you as its leader can do to curtail or prevent black political violence between blacks.
You must understand first that until apartheid has been dismantled, we will continue having problems of the nature you are referring to. These problems are essentially the creation of the apartheid system. But if you are thinking about the violence that is going on now, it is true that the element of black fighting black is there, but this is a very unimportant aspect. What is worrying us now, and the problem before the country, is the fact that state organs are being used to encourage and aggravate violence between black and black. As I have pointed out on countless occasions, in regard to the violence in Natal, we have put a pointed question to de Klerk. We have said to him, you have a strong, efficient, and well-equipped police force and army. Can you tell us why you have allowed for 4.5 years violence to continue, in which almost 4,000 people have been killed, without crushing the violence? You have taken no visible steps in order to end this violence. What is the reason? He has found it very difficult to answer the question. We have, however, provided him with the answer. We have said, you have now allowed your police to try and eliminate the ANC and its membership because you regard the ANC as the main threat to white domination. That is your problem. And that is why the government has decided not to interfere with the violence that is going on. That is the problem that faces us.
But what does that say for Mr. de Klerk's declared, professed intentions to, as he says, go forward with this irreversible process? I mean, are you saying that the government has an ace in the hole in allowing the violence in Natal?
You must remember that these are strategies which were decided by the government almost 4 years ago.
And they're out of control?
Before we decided on the peace process, or before we convinced them that it was necessary for the government to sit down and talk to us. They may now be trying to prevent this, but as I have said, they have created a monster which they can no longer control.
If the government doesn't intervene, chooses not to intervene, or is incapable of intervening, how else can that violence be dealt with?
Well, that is a problem which we have to address. But we are putting pressure on the government to do something about it. Because as long as the government remains inactive, conniving at this violence, the peace process itself is in danger.
Does the pressure involve your calling up Mr. de Klerk and saying, look, you better do something about this, or are there more other direct means of pressure?
We are discussing the matter with Mr. de Klerk. That is pressure sufficient enough. Because we are involved in the peace process, and we are saying to him, if you want peace, you will have to solve this matter.
Have you had any encouraging signs at all on this question from him?
Well, I don't want to discuss that, but we have placed the matter before them.
Ed Bradley.
Mr. Mandela, what is the acceptable outcome for you and your organization of these ongoing negotiations with the government? Does that mean one person, one vote? And what is an acceptable timetable for you to achieve your goals?
The whole issue in South Africa is about one person, one vote. That is a demand for which people have paid with their own lives. And it is a demand over which there can be no compromise. We demand that the new South Africa and the solution should be the acceptance of the principle of one man, one vote. But we can't work on the basis of timetables. It is sufficient to say that both the ANC as well as the government feel that it is urgent for us to reach a settlement. But we can't indicate schedules as to when an agreement will be reached. it is, to repeat, sufficient that we are both keen to reach a solution as soon as possible.
Are you at all concerned about the rising expectations for a solution and the demand that seems to inexorably arise to get a quick solution? Plus, there are also demographic realities. I mean, there are economic problems. There's a population that's outdistancing, outpacing the stagnating economy. I mean, I understand you saying that there are no time pressures, but are there not external factors that mitigate towards a quicker solution, a solution sooner rather than later?
We regard the maintenance of sanctions as the quickest way of helping us to reach a solution. That the government has agreed to our demands that we should sit down and talk is partly due to the internal pressure, the mass struggles that are being conducted by the people of South Africa, as well as by international pressure. And we feel, therefore, that the maintenance of sanctions will enable us to reach this goal as soon as possible, because both the ANC as well as the government are worried about the state of our economy. We want our economy to function in a healthy, we want a healthy economy, and we don't want our economy to be shattered by sanctions, as is happening today. But we, as the liberation movement, are prepared to face the situation of the economy being hit by sanctions in order for us to reach the greater goal of liberating the people of South Africa.
I read an interview in a South African magazine with the British ambassador, who said that this process has to be culminated within 3 to 5 years. Otherwise, and this is liberally paraphrasing him, the South African economy and the conditions in the region would be such that there might be just an irreparable situation. I mean, 3 to 5 years was his timetable. Do you?
Well, you can go and interview Sir Renwick and find out his reasons for saying so. We are not looking at 25 years, certainly not.
3 to 5.
We are, what?
3 to 5. 3 to 5 years,
oh, yes. Well, we are not even looking at 3 to 5. If we are able to reach a solution tonight, we will do so.
Would you let us know so we could break that on the air? You and the African National Congress repeatedly call for non-racial, non-sexist democracy in South Africa. There are people in this country who have concerns about what you mean, among them Midge Decter.
Yes, Mr. Mandela, history has taught us over and over again that there is no transition more difficult, more delicate than that from a revolutionary force to a governing party. Assuming that your aspiration for a one-man, one-vote South Africa, which would clearly mean a government in which the ANC had a preponderance of power. Assuming that, what are your ideas about the means or the mechanisms for ensuring personal individual liberty to those people, black and white, who are opposed and will be opposed to your policies?
Well, I am not a student of politics in a university. I do not know what your reasons for saying that it is difficult to get a transformation to a non-racial society. I would have thought that the example of Namibia shatters that argument altogether, because they have been able to establish a non-racial society without much difficulty. That government of national reconciliation is functioning very well and is supported by all population groups. And to us, this is something natural. We published our policy document in 1955, and that document is an attack on all forms of racialism, where the national groups, the population groups of South Africa are put on the same status, and where we declare any form of racialism a criminal offense. This is supported by the people of South Africa. We have a substantial number of whites in our movement already who are participating in policy decisions and who are participating in full without any discrimination. The fact that in our delegation to Cape Town, we had all population groups in our country shows how serious we are about a non-racial South Africa which we hope to build. We had all population groups, whereas the white delegation was drawn from the whites, and from the whites only from the Afrikaners. That shows again that we have long been addressing the question of a change from a racial society to a non-racial society. We don't expect any difficulties about this matter.
Ms. Payne?
Mr. Mandela, when the serious talks get on the way, whenever that is, the South African government has said that it will come to that negotiating table with the control and mechanism of state. They'll have the wealth of the nation. They hope to have groups like the Coloreds, the Asian, perhaps even Buthelezi. What might be your strengths and the strengths of the ANC when they come to the bargaining table, in addition to the influence possibly over international sanctions?
We are not talking about question of strength in the process of negotiation. In regard to the question that you raise, all that we're concerned with is that the people who are going to negotiate a non-racial constitution must be properly mandated through democratic elections. We say that the people who negotiate should have legitimacy, should have credibility, so that their decision can enjoy the support of the overwhelming majority of the population. That can only be done if there are non-racial and democratic elections in the country. The attitude of the government, they're free to say what they like, but they have to defend that in the course of our negotiations. And we think that we have a powerful case. The men you are talking about were elected in inverted commas, when the ANC was banned, when our activists were forced into exiles and others thrown into jail, when the leadership that was inside the country was gagged. So we had no chance whatsoever of participating in the elections. The only way of deciding who are the leaders who should negotiate is that they should be elected in non-racial elections in the country. I think we have got a powerful case which the government can never answer.
I'm going to throw my cameraman into a little bit of a tizzy here, but I think that the most appropriate follow-up at the moment may come from Wilbur Tatum. You had a question on the homelands, I believe.
Yes. There is supposed to be a great deal of power in the so-called homelands, and the South African government has spent vast amounts of money setting up that which may be, those which may be puppet governments. How might the ANC and other groups of goodwill deal with those who have been given power during the next few weeks, months, years?
The people themselves have either solved or are solving that question. We have 4 of these so-called homelands, which are constitutionally, legally independent. In 3 of these areas, in fact in 4 of them, there have been coups. In the Transkei and the Ciskies, these coups have led to the establishment of democratic governments which are working with the ANC. In a third homeland, or Bandostan, independent homeland, there was another coup which succeeded. But the man who led that coup was himself produced by the South African police. He wants to see us, he wants to discuss with us. But of course, there are problems in the sense that the people on the ground do not want him because of his record. But there has been a coup in that area. In the fourth area, Bophuthatswana, again the people took action and overthrew what is this church's name? Mangope. They overthrew him. He was installed by South African forces, but as far as the people are concerned in his area, they overthrew him. That is the first leg of the statement I have made, that the people themselves have solved or are solving that problem. Then there are 6 homelands which are not independent but self-governing. 5 of these are working with the ANC. Of course, the people in these homelands are standing up and fighting against what they consider to be discredited leaders. We are saying that we are prepared to work with these leaders. We are prepared to forget the past for the sake of presenting a united front on the question of mobilizing the country for negotiations. But we're saying to them, settle your problems with the people in your areas. We are not going to be used as a means to protect discredited leaders. Settle your problems with the people on the ground. They are doing so. But we are also discussing with them. Before we went down to Cape Town to see the government, we called a meeting of these leaders. 5 of them came. And we briefed them on what we were going to discuss with the government. After the meeting in Cape Town, we again called them and briefed them on what transpired in Cape Town, and they fully supported this. Not only that, they accepted the ANC, to use their own terminology, as the mouthpiece of the black people in the country. So the question of the power of the homelands may be an overstatement, because it does not appear to me that they are able to last if we don't want them to exist in this particular situation. But that is not necessary to decide, because they are now working with us. And the real question of the homelands is one that, in the light of the new situation of our relations with the homeland leaders, will be subject to discussion and negotiation.
Rita Hauser.
Mr. Mandela, today at the United Nations, you made a very eloquent plea on behalf of the Palestinian cause and the desire of the Palestinians for a state of their own. And in the last few days here in Questions in New York, you've made very clear that you fully support the right of Israel to exist within secure boundaries in accordance with the UN resolutions. I'd like to ask you that, in light of the apparent failure now of the United States' efforts to get a dialogue between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the ominous buildup of arms in the region, what would you suggest as practical next steps to advance that peace process?
Well, to me, the only solution of the problem in the Middle East is one of peace. For the opponents to sit down and hammer out their differences and try to effect a negotiated settlement. It is the only solution that is open to the PLO and the Israeli government. And I would urge them to do that.
Ms. Mandela, how surprised have you been about the furor that your remarks about the Palestinians and that whole Cuba and the flap that has followed in the wake of those remarks. Has that been a surprise to you at all?
I was more astonished than surprised. You must remember that when in 1960, leaders like Oliver Tambo and the young men sitting at the back there, Thabo Mbeki, went out of the country, one of the first steps that they took was to visit the West and to ask for assistance. In the course of that visit, they came to the United States of America and asked for help. They did not get that help. They went to Cuba, and the Cuba on the spot pledged support and actually gave it long before the West could do anything to assist us. I am surprised that anybody should now expect us to condemn Cuba, to condemn the PLO, which has been working with us right from the beginning and helping us in our problems. It is totally unrealistic. It is a typical attitude of countries which really do not approach the problem of South Africa from the point of view of the liberation struggle in South Africa, which approach these problems from the point of view of their own interest. What that view wants is that the African National Congress and the liberation movement in South Africa should be used for the purpose of conducting vendettas, enemies of the West. We must join that vendetta in order to advance the interests of the West. That we will not do.
You were on... for the better part of an hour and a half, you were on Ted Koppel's Nightline program last night talking about a variety of subjects. And in the front pages of some newspapers today, the remarks that you made within the course of that hour about this matter were played as the lead items. Why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that kind of attention is being paid to this issue?
Would you please go to the editors of those papers?
Does that disturb you?
I have not even seen the reports.
But they're there.
You have kept me so busy that I can't even read newspapers.
The reports are there. Does that disturb you?
Well, I hear it for the first time. I am as astonished as I was when this furor originally arose.
I'm going to throw the cameraman into another tizzy, but Tammy Holtman had a question about what I perceive to be a new phrase within the context of your proclamations, the part that deals with the non-sexist, non-racial South Africa. What your question, Tammy?
Mr. Mandela, at a recent meeting of African women from around the continent, women from several places talked about how they had participated in the struggle to free their countries only to be pushed into the background after independence. And several delegates warned women from Namibia and South Africa not to let the same thing happen to them. You've spoken of your hope for a non-sexist as well as a non-racist South Africa. But what can you do to guarantee that women will be able to play an equal role in the South Africa of the future?
Well, the ANC has opened its doors to women in accordance with the declaration that we have made, to which you have referred. In the delegation that went to Cape Town, for example, there were no less than 2 women. That shows our attitude on this question. We will place no limitations whatsoever on the right of the women to take part in the political activities of the country and, of course, in other spheres. We will encourage that. How this will be done will be determined by the issues that arise. If any issues arise which may put obstacles in the path of the women to participate fully in running the country. We will deal with it as the problems arise. But our policy is perfectly clear, and we are already implementing it.
Anthony Lewis of the New York Times.
Mr. Mandela, President de Klerk is in trouble with white voters, losing them to the right. You've advised him while here that the best thing to do is to open the vote to everybody, and that would solve his political problem. Are you suggesting in that, and I mean this seriously, that in future he could be the part of a government with the ANC, that somehow there would be a coalition of the National Party and the ANC, or there'd be a role for both of you in a future democratic government?
We are not thinking in terms of individuals. We are thinking in terms of ideas and policies. What we are saying is that the only solution to the problems of South Africa is the introduction of a non-racial society. If Mr. de Klerk takes advantage of the 4 years in which he's still going to remain in power and extends the vote to all South Africans, then the idea for which the National Party and the ANC are working, that idea then will be assured of success. And all those who stand for that idea will be in an invincible position, and the right will be rendered completely useless. That is the message we're putting forward. The president of the new South Africa might be Oliver Tambo, it might be de Klerk, it might be Thabo Mbeki there, or Mr. Sisulu.
Or Nelson Mandela.
That rests on the people of South Africa themselves.
Olaro Otuno.
Mr. Mandela, the question of apartheid in South Africa has preoccupied the attention and energy of the rest of the African continent like no other issue. Now, with the independence of Namibia and the prospect of a liberated South Africa, your part of the continent has become a spot of hope in a continent which is going through a very difficult time. What would you see as the possible impact on the rest of the African continent of a South Africa which is free from apartheid?
Well, that's a very important question. South Africa, because of its developed economic system and other infrastructures, could be the powerhouse not only of our region, but of the greater part of Africa. A liberated South Africa would, in the first place, be a member of SADC, which is already examining the question of pooling the resources in our region, so that the whole region should profit from those pooled resources.
You might explain SADC just very briefly.
Well, I'm sure SADC is known to most of the people here. Please don't despise them. They know very well about South Africa. See?
We have a larger audience out there that may not realize that it's an economic organization aimed at stimulating.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you very much for assisting. And the potential which would immediately be developed by a liberated South Africa joining SADC is tremendous, is immeasurable. And that would stimulate economic development in our region and possibly in Africa. But we don't want to overstate the benefits that would derive from a liberated South Africa joining SADC, because most of the problems of Africa, it must be remembered, it must always be remembered, are a legacy of the colonial days. And because Africa has not got sufficient resources it's going to take years and even generations before they can overcome those legacies. But a liberated South Africa can play an important role in the economic development of our region as well as parts of Africa.
We are entering the last phase of this very interesting program, Mr. Mandela.
I'm very sorry to hear that.
But we haven't finished yet. Jackie Mitchell-Johnson.
In a post-apartheid South Africa, how would you propose to break down some of the old ideological biases which would prevent policymakers and businesses from taking a fresh look at the political and economic situation?
Well, your question is a very broad one. I can understand the trend, but I may miss the exact point on which you want comment. As I understand it, the two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, are now busy trying to thaw the Cold War. They are busy on the question of promoting international peace. They seem to have come to an understanding that there must be no conflict between them on specific problems in particular regions. And at least the two leaders today, President Gorbachev and President George Bush, they seem to be addressing the problems of the world very seriously and also making progress. And I hope that by the time South Africa gets liberated, we will not have to worry about these problems at all.
Are you at all concerned that the attention has shifted now with this rapprochement toward Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, possibly at the expense of Africa?
Well, I don't know. It has been said that the changes that have taken place in Eastern Europe will mean that the West will now be concerned with investing in those countries, and that there will be no sufficient funds to help in developing South Africa. I hope this is not the case. It is, of course, quite correct for the West to try and assist the countries in Eastern Europe who have got problems of their own. But we hope that will not be at the expense of assisting in developing a non-racial South Africa after apartheid has been dismantled.
Very briefly, we want to look at some of the concerns around U.S. policy. Richard Moose, I believe you have a question.
Mr. Mandela, you've stressed during your visit the importance which you attach to economic pressure to the United States maintaining or sanctions on South Africa. You undoubtedly will have succeeded in stimulating new debate on that subject. Sanctions debate often takes on a life of its own here in the United States. As that goes forward, are there other actions that you have considered that you think the United States should take towards South Africa at this moment?
Well, our main message is the maintenance of sanctions by the international community in general and by the United States in particular. And that is the message that we are going to give. That is the request that we are going to make to President Bush when we meet him. We are also concerned about the rehabilitation of the almost 20,000 political exiles who have to come back to the country, who require housing and jobs and educational facilities for their children. We are also rebuilding the African National Congress, which has been banned over 30 years. And this is a very difficult task because however much success we are having in rallies and public meetings, and we are drawing crowds which have never been seen in the history of the country, but if those crowds are not functioning through a disciplined and organized political struggle, where there is a machinery through which they can be reached, we can fail very badly in our aims and objects. And it becomes necessary, therefore, for us to have the resources to rebuild the ANC. But even more, equally important, is the fact that we are now mobilizing the whole country for peace. That is a task which now puts us as the ANC in a totally different category from that in which we were regarded. Many people regarded us as a political party, pure and simple, and they refused to assist because of this approach. In fact, we have never been a political party. We have always been a political organization. We have always been a parliament of the black people in this country, where people from different walks of life and with different political affiliations are members of the organization, joined only by the determination to oppose racial oppression. Now, I am going to ask the people of the United States to give us resources to be able to meet these needs and to carry out these duties.
Ms. Mandela,
we are also faced with the question of young people leaving the country because of the state of black education, which is far inferior to that of the whites. And they are seeing their compatriots in the neighboring states receiving better education than they receive in their own country. Then, of course, there's the question of violence. And all these have forced large numbers of our young people to leave the country in search of education abroad in the schools established by the ANC. But we have not got the resources and would like the people of the United States to help in this regard, because we will be equipping our youth for their duties as future leaders.
Do you also want the United States government to help in this resource garnering?
Why not?
Why
not?
Will you ask?
You want to discriminate?
Would you? Would you ask President Bush when you ask him to maintain?
I will not discuss here what I will ask President Bush. I will do that directly to him, and you can ask me that question after the meeting.
All right. Let me just look in the last couple of minutes that we have to what your feelings about the coming months ahead. Where do your greatest anxieties lie?
Well, I don't think I've got any anxieties at all. I am, of course, anxious that a settlement be reached as soon as possible in our country. But I am optimistic that our hopes are not in vain, and that the efforts, the success of which we have received so far, especially having regard to the first meeting between the ANC and the government, has raised our hopes that even in the more difficult phase, where we will now be negotiating for a non-racial constitution, that we might make progress which will enable us to reach a solution as soon as possible.
When you see the continuing struggle that America is waging to overcome racial discrimination, despite the existence of a constitution that speaks in terms of equality, and despite the fact that there are civil rights laws on the books that outlaw discrimination, what, if any, lessons do you think the American experience holds for South Africa, and indeed vice versa?
Well, we will look at the way in which the United States has handled these problems. We are aware of the complaints by black leaders in this country that they are not getting the rights which are guaranteed in the American Constitution. We are aware of complaints that racialism still exists in this country. Our own position is very clear. We condemn racialism wherever it is to be found in the world. And we sympathize with a stand by black leaders in this country in demanding that they should be able to take advantage of the rights which the law gives them. We stand fully behind them in that regard. We will, however, look at the way in which America has tried to solve its problems, including the question of racialism in its constitution. And any provision which makes it possible for the government to eliminate racialism will be useful to us. And that is what we will do. We will look at the constitutions of many countries, including that of the United States of America.
Well, Mr. Mandela, we know that you have a long road ahead of you, and we thank you for being with us and wish you all the best in that road ahead.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure.